Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. Here is a gripping compilation of mountain climbing incidents that tell tales of both survival and tragedy. These stories bring to life the challenging experiences of climbers who faced the world's toughest peaks, enduring extreme conditions and unexpected dangers. From the people who managed to return safely, to the sad stories of those who didn't make it, this collection shows the raw power of nature and the strong human spirit. Dive into these stories that capture the adventure, bravery, and the real-life struggles of life and death in the mountains. This is Their Horrifying Stories. Viewer discretion is advised. Located in the Bernese Alps in Switzerland, the highly coveted Eiger overlooks the beautiful village of Grindelwald in the district of Interlaken. Not much details have been recorded of the first successful summit, but the Eiger summit was first reached by Irishman Charles Barrington along with two guides from Grindelwald named Christian Almer and Peter Boren. The historic climb happened on August 11, 1858 through the West Flank and West Ridge route. There had been many expeditions that followed since then, but there has never been a single serious attempt to climb the picturesque summit through its north face route, fondly called the Eiger Wand. The fact that the Eiger Wand has been unclimbed for many years had its obvious reasons. It had steep slopes at an angle of around 70 degrees, required long ascents with no convenient resting stops, and more than anything else, was highly prone to avalanches due to its loose rock and snow. During summer, when mountain climbing expeditions are usually at its peak, rocks the size of a fist frequently fall off and melted snow usually makes its way down the mountain's steep slopes. Also, because it was concave in shape, the mountain's wide face was constantly under a shadow, making it very cold. Strong winds are also a challenge. And so, more often than not, conditions at the face get very different from the weather at the mountain's base. With all these factors combined, it's basically a disaster waiting to happen. In 1935, however, two highly experienced German climbers from Bavaria were daring enough to risk the first ever serious attempt to conquer the Eiger Wand. The brave adventurers were Karl Maringer and Max Sedlmayr. Now, Eiger actually had train tracks up to one-third on the way up, at the Eiger Wand station. Additionally, what sets the Eiger expeditions apart was the fact that its face can almost entirely be seen from a small mountain resort at the base of the mountain. On good weather, guests at Klein Scheidegg, the resort town, could clearly see the climbers going up the north face route. Thus, when the two German climbers made the daring first attempt, the media gathered and stayed at the resort to witness through their binoculars and document the record-breaking attempt. The plan to conquer the summit was estimated to take around 2 to 3 days, so the two brought 6 days' worth of supplies with them. They arrived at Eiger Wand station and set up camp to spend the night there. The next morning, onlookers from the resort town watched them as they went ahead slowly but surely, through the first major ice field of the whole climb. By the third day, they went through the second major ice field and surpassed it. Onlookers saw the two climbers already near the summit, but then not long after, thick clouds blocked their view of the face. It was only on the fifth day that the skies cleared and the Eiger Wand was again visible to them below. The scene that unfolded shocked the onlookers. The whole face of the mountain was now covered in thick fresh snow. Apparently, an avalanche blocked their way going down, so they could no longer descend in the same route. It left the pair with nowhere to go but up. They were able to reach the third ice field, still thousands of feet to go until they reached the summit. Unfortunately, no more traces of the two climbers have been observed since then. A few days later, a search and rescue plane hovered above the Eiger trying to look for the two climbers and found them all frozen, with one still standing in the ice field. Because of this, the third ice field was then called the Death Bivouac. This first attempt may have ended tragically, but it didn't stop other daring climbers to take on the challenge. Immediately, in the year that followed, around 10 men had planned to give it a try. Some of them were even the climbers that had been part of the search and rescue operations the year prior. Come July 1936, 6 out of the 10 had to back out of the risky climb due to extreme weather conditions and a few accidents. The 4 climbers, however, remain unfazed by the obvious dangers of the Eiger. 2 men named Andreas Hinterstoicer and Toni Kurz were from Bavaria, while the other 2, Willi Angerer and Eddie Rayner, were from Austria. Initially, these 4 climbers were grouped by pair, but they all decided to team up and proceed with the climb with all 4 of them together. Day 1 of their climb had its own misadventures. Andreas slipped and fell 37 meters down the mountain face, but thankfully, he was able to come out of the fall unscathed, and the group continued to move forward. Upon reaching one of the steep rock faces now known as Hinterstoicer Traverse, Andreas fixed some ropes so the 4 of them could cross to the other side of the rock face. When they reached the other side, he untied the ropes, a move they would later on regret doing. As the sun began to set that first day, clouds also began to block the onlookers' view. Along with the sunrise the following day, skies cleared up and onlookers were back to checking on the group's progress. It was then that they noticed something odd, having no idea exactly what they had missed over the night. Eddie and Willi were no longer moving forward, and from afar, people could see Eddie seeming to be attending to Willi. After a while, Andreas and Toni then dropped a rope to where Willi was, as Willi now proceeded on with Eddie carefully following after him. It was already noon when the 4 reached the death bivouac, where the 2 German climbers who died a year prior were found. Onlookers could see how Willi was really struggling with his injury. Then the next thing they knew, all 4 climbers were now starting with their descent. It was then that onlookers were able to confirm Willi's serious condition, enough to make them abandon the climb. They reached the second ice field by the end of day 2. However, going back down to the first ice field, their biggest hurdle would be the rock face that they had traversed using the fixed ropes. Since Andreas took the ropes off, it was harder to set it up during descent, and it was the only way going down. The following day, conditions became worse. A storm came, and avalanche upon avalanche rolled down the mountain's steep slopes, bringing rocks tumbling along with the snow. Because of this, visibility from the resort town was close to zero, but after a while the clouds cleared up and people were able to see the serious threat and challenge it created on the climbers. The rock face that the climbers were heading next to had already been covered with a frozen layer following the avalanche. Rain has also poured down the night prior, so you can just imagine how thick and slippery the frozen fresh rainwater was. There was no way they could still pass through the traverse. It left the climbers with no other option but to rappel down the 600-foot cliff face. Albert von Almen, a fellow mountaineer who was one of the onlookers below, decided to take the train going to Eiger Tunnel, upon realizing the 4 climbers' desperate situation. He went to the windows near the base of the cliff that the 4 were about to rappel through. Albert peeked out the window and yelled to check on the 4. Surprisingly, all 4 responded to him and told him they would be down soon. Knowing the climbers needed to warm themselves after this grueling ordeal was over, Albert went on to prepare a pot of tea as he awaited their arrival. 2 hours went by and there were no signs of the climbers yet. Albert was becoming worried, so he peeked out the window once more and yelled to check on them. However, only one responded. It was Toni Kurz. The strong winds made it difficult to hear Toni clearly, but Albert was able to catch 2 points. The other 3 were dead, and Toni, the sole survivor, was now hanging hundreds of feet above the train tunnel window, left with no other way to proceed with the descent alone. Without delay, Albert immediately called the Eiger Gletscher station at the mountain's base and sought for a rescue party to be sent there quickly. Knowing the extreme risks, the head of the Mountain Rescue Committee had this policy that no one should be forced to join any rescue mission. That day, 3 guides willingly volunteered and hopped on the train to the tunnel window where Albert was. They went out of the Eiger tunnel through the windows and hiked up diagonally, heading for the base of the cliff where Toni was now stuck. When they reached the base, Toni recounted to the 3 rescuers what happened hours prior. At that point, they could all still hear the strength in Toni's voice despite that day have been day 3 of their climb. Toni told them they were beginning to rappel down when an avalanche rolled down and hit all 4 of them. Andreas completely fell off the face of the mountain to sure death. Now, Toni and the other 2 climbers, Willi and Eddie, were tied to a single rope together. Toni was positioned in the middle. Willie and Tony had also been wiped out of the mountain's face, sending them down the cliff. The rope they were attached to got tangled around Willie's neck, causing him to be strangled to death. Eddie, on the other end of the rope, who was left on top of the cliff face, crashed against a huge rock and broke his skull. He initially survived but later on froze to death. He was still pressed against the rock, allowing Tony to keep hanging alive down below him. Tony was in the middle of the cliff face, hanging around 300 feet away from both the top and bottom of the cliff face. Rescuers needed to climb another 600 feet of loose ice if they intended to reach Tony. If they were also to throw a rope up to Tony, 300 feet was simply too far to throw it up. The sun was now beginning to set. The rescuers knew there was even greater risk if they went on with the rescue attempt in the cold of the night. So they told Tony they would be descending back to the train tunnel and return the next morning. Tony cried out and begged for rescue, telling them that he might not make it through the night, as the volunteers headed back to the tunnel window. Early the next morning, they went back to the cliff base and saw Tony with 8-inch-long icicles already hanging from his boots. Overnight, a strong wind flew his mitten off of his left hand, and now it had been completely frozen up to his lower left arm. As the volunteers were back to their rescue attempt, they knew that with the equipment they had then, it was nearly impossible to climb up the frozen rock face. They first attempted to throw Tony a rope, even using rockets to launch the rope further to the height where Tony was. However, after many tries, the ropes just kept flying away from the cliff instead of nearer to Tony. The second plan involved was for Tony to lower down a small rope to them, and once it reached them, they would tie one of the rescue ropes for Tony to pull up and attach to the existing rope. In that way, Tony could now have an extended rope which he could continue rappelling all the way down to the base of the cliff. However, Tony didn't have any other rope left. They had to look for another rope for Tony to lower down. Then, the rescuers thought of a plan, but it would need Tony's little strength left to pull off. The rescuers instructed Tony to rappel all the way down to the end of the rope and cut away Willie's frozen body. After cutting it off, he would need to pull himself up the rope again and secure himself before cutting the rope below him. Once cut, he would now have a small rope which he could untwine to have multiple thinner ropes that he could tie together to make a longer rope. This longer but thinner rope would then need to be lowered down to where the rescuers were so they could attach a stronger rope for him to pull up. Once Tony got the stronger rope from the rescue team, he would have to tie and connect it to his rope so he could continue on with his descent. In almost 5 grueling hours, he cut off Willie's dead body from the rope, which didn't actually fall because his body had already been stuck frozen to the cliff, pulled himself up to around 25 feet with only one hand and cut off the rope below him with his axe. He had to untwine the rope and connect it all together using only his right hand and his teeth. Tony struggled but managed to secure the thinner rope that he would be lowering down to the rescuers. When afternoon came, another avalanche of snow and rocks came tumbling down. It detached Willie's frozen body from the cliff face, sending the dead body rolling past the rescuers to the bottom of the mountain. After much struggle, Tony was able to finally lower a thinner rope down to the rescuers. The rescuers tied a thicker and stronger rope and a few climbing supplies in case Tony might be needing it on the way down. Apparently, the rope they attached still fell short in length, so they tied a second rope on one end. Slowly, Tony pulled the rescue rope along with the gears up. With his left arm frozen, it took Tony around an hour to pull it all up, tie it to his rope and eventually start rappelling down the cliff. Tony was already very close to the cliff base. The rescuers could already see him about 20 feet above them when suddenly, Tony had already reached the end of the first rescue rope. The knot that connected the 2 ropes attached by the rescuers was too big to fit through Tony's carabiner. Tony grunted and groaned as he tried to force the knot through the carabiner. The rescuers could hear his frustration, just as they were frustrated themselves. They tried to motivate him, shouting and telling him this would be the last and final hurdle he needed to conquer. After all that he had been through, he was 20 feet away from his much-needed rescue, and yet, having drained all of his energy, ironically, he felt so far. Tony tilted forward, toward the cliff, and tried using his teeth one last time. His left arm stuck out frozen, his lips barely moved as he struggled with frostbite and exhaustion. Not a single ounce of energy was left in Tony's body. He could no longer do it. Then, with a weak voice, he uttered the words, "I'm finished," before his body lay lifeless hanging over the rescuers. The rope was almost within reach of the rescuers, if only a few feet more. Tony got so close, yet he still didn't make it. In the end, the 1936 attempt ended tragically with all 4 climbers dead, twice the fatalities of the first attempt in the year prior. The first successful attempt to conquer the Eiger through the Eiger Wand route only happened in July 1938 by 2 German climbers named Anderl Heckmair and Ludwig Vorg. On January 25, 1959, a group of 10 hikers arrived at the city of Ivdel in the northern province of Sverdlovsk Oblast. These 8 men and 2 women were either students or graduates of Ural Polytechnical Institute, all experienced in both long ski tours and mountain expeditions. Led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, the plan was to reach Gora-Ortoten Mountain, which stands 1,182 meters above sea level and is part of the Ural mountain ranges, on a 14-day expedition. From Ivdel, the group traveled by land on a truck to Vizhay. By the end of the expedition, the group planned to return to Vizhay, and once back, Dyatlov was expected to send a telegram to their sports club no later than February 12. And so on the 27th, the group started their hike at Vizhay onto their journey to Ortoten. However, the following day, one of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, experienced joint pains and decided to abandon the climb. Before going separate ways, Dyatlov had advised Yudin to expect a slight delay in their return. The 9 hikers continued on with their expedition, documenting their climb with the use of diaries and cameras. February 12 came, yet Dyatlov and the rest of the team were unheard of. Because they've already anticipated a slight delay, they waited for a few more days. 8 days later, on February 20th, there were still no updates from Dyatlov's team. At this point, families and relatives were getting worried and started pushing that a search be conducted. That same day, a search and rescue operation was then mounted. The rescuers were able to retrieve the diaries and cameras which they left at their last camp, allowing the rescue team to have a glimpse of the hikers' route until that point. By February 26, the responders discovered the group's severely damaged tent on Kholat Syakhl. The tent was torn and covered with snow. Nobody was inside, but all their stuff was inside the tent. After further investigation, they realized the tent had actually been cut open from the inside. Since shoes were also found inside the tent, they believed the hikers either ran out with only their socks on, or worse, barefoot. The next thing rescuers found were a series of footprints that either belonged to 8 or 9 people. The rescuers followed these footprints and it led them to the edge of the woods 1.5 kilometers opposite the pass where their tent was found. However, as they moved forward, the footprints were already covered with snow. The woods then became the focus of the search, and not long after, the team found marks of a fire under a huge cedar tree. Beside it were the remains of the first 2 hikers, 23-year-old Yuri Krivoshenko and 21-year-old Yuri Doroshenko. The 2 were barefoot and did not have clothes on. Strangely, they were just out there in their underwear. There were also a few broken branches on the ground. Doroshenko's body was found in a brown-purple state, gray foam coming out of his right cheek and gray liquid from his mouth. Both their hands appeared to be scraped. Upon further investigation, it has been identified that one of the bodies had been moved after having died, as the area where the blood settled post-mortem was inconsistent with the position in which the body was found. The next day, the search continued and Igor Dyatlov's body was eventually found 300 meters away from the cedar tree to the direction of the tent. Another hiker's body, 22-year-old Zenaida Kolmogorova, was found a little bit farther, around 630 meters from the tree, with a baton-shaped bruise on her side. After 6 days, on March 5, the body identified to be that of 23-year-old Rustam Slobodin was found 480 meters away from the cedar. He had sustained head injuries as if he had fallen and hit his head multiple times. All 3 bodies were found in such a position that faced the direction of the tent, seemingly trying to make their way back to the tent. No serious injuries had been found, although Slobodan had been found with a small crack in the skull. Still, the investigation pointed to hypothermia as the main cause of death. With 5 bodies already found, the search continued for the remaining 4 hikers, but it wasn't until 2 months later that the search came to its final close. On May 5, 1959, in a ravine 50 meters from the cedar tree opposite the direction of the tent, bodies of the remaining hikers were found buried under snow that was 4 meters thick. Compared to the first 5 bodies found, these 4 had more clothing on. In fact, it seemed that some of the hikers had taken the clothes of the hikers who died first and wore it themselves. But it was not just because of the borrowing of clothes that made their death an even greater mystery. Rather, the fatal injuries in which the second group of bodies had been found have brought the investigation to an unexpected turn. 20-year-old Ludmila Dubanina was found wearing a brown sweater believed to have belonged to Krivonischenko, one of the 5 hikers who were first retrieved. Further investigation showed that the sweater was radioactive and had sustained major fractures in the chest. However, what was even more strange was that Dubanina's tongue, eyes, part of her lips, a facial tissue and a fragment of her skull bone were missing when her body was found. 23-year-old Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had apparently been found wearing Dubanina's fur coat and hat. His body had also suffered from major skull damage, but no external wounds were found. Meanwhile, 38-year-old Semyon Zolotaryov's body was found to be wearing the hat that was believed to be that of Doroshenko, also one of the first 2 bodies found. Zolotaryov was also found to have sustained major fractures in the chest similar to Dubanina, and yet there were no external injuries. Doroshenko's overalls were also found in the body of another hiker, 24-year-old Alexander Kolevatov. Further investigation also revealed that the waistband of the sweater he was wearing and the lower part of his ski trousers were found to be radioactive. Strangely, their bodies were discovered a few feet away from an improvised shelter in the deep part of the ravine. It was around 4 square meters in size, and it was believed to have been built by the hikers themselves by digging out a portion of the snow and using branches as makeshift shelter. There were still a few clothes seen hanging on the cedar tree's branches, believed to belong to that of the first 2 bodies found under the tree. However, for some unknown reason, the clothes were not used. Upon a closer look at the 3 hikers that sustained fatal injuries, the doctor had noted that only a force comparable to a car crash could explain the injuries they sustained, and because there were no visible external wounds, the most probable cause suggests that they were subjected to extreme levels of pressure. Despite the injuries, what was clear at that point was that the main cause of death for all 9 hikers was hypothermia. However, the mysterious deaths and the conditions in which the group's bodies had been found are seemingly hard to piece together. This has led many to come up with various theories with regard to the actual cause of the group's tragic demise. Many Soviets considered the angle of a possible attack by the local Mansi tribesmen, which prompted the group's sudden dispersal and chaos, leading to the major injuries sustained by some of the hikers. However, the Mansi tribe were believed to be peace-loving people. Also, the absence of severe external injuries and absence of any other footprints aside from the hikers eventually disproved this claim. Another angle looked into was the occurrence of a sudden and powerful avalanche that could have brought the hikers in complete shock, leading them to escape their tents with no time to dress up. This theory would have explained the extent of their internal injuries caused by a heavy and forceful collapse of snow. However, investigators noted that there had been no physical evidence of a recent avalanche when the bodies had been found, let alone a single record of an avalanche in the area over the years. No debris and no significant damage had been observed in the forest area as well. Others believed that the strange behavior displayed by the hikers and the condition that the bodies have been found, especially the lack of clothing, suggested that the hikers had lost their sound judgment, an early symptom of hypothermia. The hikers must have unreasonably thought their bodies were in a state of overheating just when they were about to die due to hypothermia, resulting in them taking off their clothes instead of seeking to keep themselves warm. However, this theory couldn't explain why the hikers left their tents in such a haste when it could have been their refuge from the cold. The angle of romance resulting in conflict has also been considered. Some speculations arose based on the dating history of some of the hikers, seemingly explaining the reason why some of the hikers were not appropriately clothed and might have led to conflict or argument within the group. However, this couldn't explain the fact that the injuries found in some of the hikers could only be inflicted by a force greater than any human can, aside from the fact that many could attest to the harmonious relationship of the group. Because the extent of the injuries pointed to a non-human force, another angle suggested that the hikers could have been attacked by a menk, a Russian mythical creature, especially with the condition in which Dubinina was found, having had missing parts of the face. Another theory, on the other hand, emphasized the evidence that has been found to be radioactive, leaning towards the possibility that the hikers had died after being accidentally hit by a radioactive weapon in a secret government testing operation. A statement of another group of hikers who camped 50 kilometers away from Dyatlov's team supported this theory, as they claimed to have seen orange orbs flying in the sky above Kholat Syakhl. This theory suggests that the sound of the radioactive weapon must have triggered their sudden escape from the tents inappropriately dressed, leading the first two groups of hikers found to their eventual death due to hypothermia. While the remaining 4 hikers were believed to have suffered a direct hit, which explains their injuries. Chief investigator Lev Ivanov strongly believed in this theory, as later expressed in a local newspaper in Kazakhstan in 1990. However, the Soviet Union forced him to let go of conducting further investigation on this angle due to censorship and secrecy. Furthermore, if radiation was indeed the cause of their demise, higher levels of radioactive substances would have been found in their bodies and not the minimal level in which they had been tested. Ultimately, the Russian government refused to look into the case deeper and instead closed the investigation shortly after, with no details presented. Their deaths had only been attributed to incompetence and natural catastrophe. It was not until 2019 that the case had been reopened by Russian officials, but only 3 theories had been looked into: the avalanche, a snow slab, or a hurricane. Not long after, the case has been closed once more without more solid details, simply ruling out the possibility of a criminal angle. Then, in July 2020, Alexander Puzrin, a professor of geotechnical engineering in Zurich, and Johann Gaume, head of the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, reopened the study into the avalanche theory. The results of their study was published in the Communications, Earth and Environment journal in 2021, detailing with a much stronger basis that a huge snow slab had great potential to cause an avalanche, leading to the hikers' deaths. In 2022, they released video footage at the Dyatlov Pass, the exact area where the bodies had been found, showing a simulation in the avalanche that may have possibly occurred many years back. With a more concrete explanation, many believe that this is finally the official closure to the mystery behind the Dyatlov Pass incident. However, many others still remain skeptical behind this tragic incident more than 6 decades ago, which cost the lives of 9 young hikers. Today, a monument of the 9 hikers can be found in the Mykajlov Cemetery at Ekaterinburg, where their bodies have been buried along with the ultimate and indisputable truth no living man will ever know. To this day, the slope in which they had been found still remains to be called the Dyatlov Pass in honor of the 9. In the treacherous realm of the mighty Himalayas, nestled amidst the awe-inspiring peaks, is Mount Everest. It is the world's tallest mountain, with a total elevation of 8,849 meters above sea level, that many daring mountaineers and adventurers seek to conquer at least once in their lifetime. One of them was Beck Weathers. 49-year-old Beck Weathers has conquered quite a number of peaks already, making him one of the more experienced climbers in the group of the 1996 expedition organized by Rob Hall. Rob, a mountaineer from New Zealand, first climbed the Earth's tallest peak in 1990. 7 months later, Rob Hall and his climbing buddy Gary Ball had already conquered the highest peaks of every other continent, among the fastest periods to ever conquer the so-called 7 summits. Since then, they've organized commercial expeditions to Everest and a couple other summits. In 1993, he lost his buddy Gary to a certain type of altitude sickness in one of their climbs to another mountain. Yet in spite of the tragedy, Rob continued what he and Gary started. He resumed guiding expeditions to Everest in 1994. Rob was strict when it came to safety. He always had this time limit set for a safe descent. In fact, in 1995, he had a group turn around despite already reaching the south summit, close to the actual summit, due to shortage of time and extreme snow. Hearing of Rob Hall's reputation, this urged Beck to join and spend $65,000 just to be part of this expedition, clearly something that he was very determined to do. To him, conquering Everest was not just something he wanted to do but rather something he badly needed as he battled with depression. Despite the outward success he obviously had, a successful career as a pathologist in Texas, a 20-year marriage to his wife Peach and an intact family, he has always felt alone. His mental condition was severe to the point that he had suicidal tendencies. He struggled with it greatly, and in his attempts to fight it, he realized that the only effective distraction was when he pushed his body to its limits. It is only when he challenges himself on such extreme activities that he forgets life's problems and struggles. Now, right before he ventured into this expedition to the world's tallest peak, Beck underwent a surgery called radial keratotomy. This involved micro-incisions to his corneas and was intended to rectify his short-sightedness. After the medical procedure, he was now set to depart for Nepal. It was spring of 1996, led by Rob Hall, and together with his fellow climbers, they embarked on the arduous journey up Everest's treacherous slopes. By May 10, 1996, they were already in their high camp at South Col, ready to take on their last stretch to the summit. Getting there would roughly take between 12 to 14 hours, but the weather was clear and everyone had their eyes on the prize. As they climbed higher and higher, it was then that Beck started sensing problems with his recently corrected eyes. His corneas started to gradually change shape at the height that they were going and left Beck partially blind in the dark. This slowed him down, but he never gave up. Going further slowly but surely, he eventually realized that the bright rays of the sun would trigger his iris to close by reflex, thereby protecting his retina and naturally finding a way around his cornea problem. This continued to support his sense of depth. However, as he tried to wipe his misty eyes with his fingers, he accidentally scratched an ice crystal onto his right eye. His left eye was spared, but Beck lost his visual sense of depth, making it extremely dangerous in such a terrain. Thus, Rob decided Beck should not go any further due to his condition. It was still around 7:30 in the morning. Rob instructed Beck to stay put and wait for him to come back. Beck promised and stuck to it. Apparently, it was Rob who broke his promise. He never came back. As the rest of the climbers ventured higher with Rob to the summit, a storm ensued quickly and overtook them. Rob got stranded just below the summit with another climber, Doug Hansen, who was also part of the expedition a year prior. Many believe that the previous expedition that failed to reach the summit in 1995 clouded Rob's decisions that year and prompted him to disregard the time limit set. He allowed Doug to push through to the summit, but by the time they started to descend, Doug was already too weak. Other climbers have already told Rob to leave Doug and continue moving down, but he dismissed them and still stayed with Doug in the midst of the storm. Sadly, Rob passed away that evening. Meanwhile, Beck continued to wait for Rob despite having been invited by other climbers to start making their descent. Around 5 in the afternoon, almost 10 hours since Rob left him, Beck began to worry about Rob. About the same time, John Krakauer, another climber, descended and told Beck of Rob's decision to stay with Doug. John offered to assist Beck with the descent, but Beck decided to wait for Mike Groom, Rob's co-guide in the expedition, before beginning his descent. Mike helped Beck crawl back to South Col, as they descended with a small group of climbers. During that night, the storm intensified and everything around them was just all white, as if getting lost inside a bottle of milk. Confused and disoriented as they were trying to search for their tents at the camp, the group of climbers almost fell off the edge of the mountain. Beck lost his right glove, causing his hand to freeze, in the midst of all that chaos and confusion. Now overcome with exhaustion, they were forced to camp out in the open that night. Just when Beck thought he'd got it all figured out, the strong wind threw him to the ground. His oxygen levels were now too low and he's suffering from extreme hypothermia. He was now on the brink of death. Help finally arrived that same night. Russian guide Anatoly Bukrev rescued the climbers, but as he checked on Beck, lying unconscious and frozen, he deemed he was already dead. The following morning, Canadian Dr. Stuart Hutchinson along with 3 Sherpas came to look for Beck and Yasuko Namba, a Japanese woman who was also left behind during the initial rescue the night prior. He first checked on Yasuko, whose skin was already porcelain white and her eyes dilated. There was nothing that could be done for her. He then shifted his attention to Beck, who was already partially buried in snow. His right arm was completely frozen and ice had already formed around his face. As Dr. Stewart would put it, Beck was so close to death yet still breathing and knew that in that condition, there was no chance of survival. Thus, he left Beck and went back to camp, pronouncing him dead. Reports already included Beck in the list of casualties, and Peach, his wife, had been informed of her husband's untimely demise. However, in a miraculous turn of events around 4 that afternoon, he woke up as if from a dream and as if he was sleeping comfortably on his bed, still unable to figure out where he was or what happened to him. His frozen arm caught his attention and hit it on the ground. It was only upon hearing the woody sound that his arm made upon hitting the ground did he come to his senses. Adrenaline started to kick in and he knew that if he didn't push himself to stand up, he'd definitely be dead in no time. So Beck gathered himself together, got up and slowly made his way back to camp in spite of his feet being all numb and frozen. To the shock of other climbers and rescuers, Beck managed to reach the low-level camp. Beck Weathers appeared with his face darkened due to frostbite and limbs that may never be restored to its normal state. Still, he managed to move and talk, thankful to be alive. He believes he is most likely the first person to ever wake up from a hypothermic coma. Against all odds, Beck survived the harrowing ordeal. Tragically, however, the mountain claimed the lives of several of his companions, 8 climbers in all. Their dreams are forever lost to the unforgiving heights. Despite these, Beck's survival was not without a price. Severe frostbite had ravaged his hands and face, necessitating multiple surgeries and amputation, including his nose. Thankfully, skillful surgeons were able to use skin obtained from his neck and ear to reconstruct his nose and his forehead. The physical scars he bore were a constant reminder of the immense challenges he had overcome. Because of his experience, Beck Weathers became a symbol of resilience and human spirit. His story shed light on the inherent risks and uncertainties of mountaineering, and the fine line that separates triumph from tragedy on the world's tallest peak. Over the years since then, Beck has dedicated himself to sharing his experience and advocating for safety in mountaineering. But more than his experience at the mountain, he lives to tell of the danger such obsession to the sport actually holds. At some point in his life, climbing became his primary focus and greatest distraction that everything else went secondary, including his marriage and his family. In fact, Peach was on the brink of filing for a divorce as soon as Beck came back from the expedition. After the horrifying incident, she decided to stay at his side and took care of him, eventually leading to a saved marriage. For the first time, Beck finally found peace despite the injuries he got from the ordeal. Ironically, he feels most at ease now with his own body than he ever did before the accident. His story stands as a stark reminder that even the mightiest of mountains can humble the proudest of adventurers. 31-year-old Tony Strether was a soldier from the Royal Military Academy and has been part of many climbing expeditions. Some of his expeditions were the American K2 expedition in 1953 and the first ascent to Kanchenjunga in 1955. He also held the record of being the first man to conquer 2 summits higher than 7,600 meters. With his extensive experience, Strether became the expedition leader of the 5-man team from the Oxford University Mountaineering Club that was set out to conquer Mount Haramosh. Along with him were Bernard Gillett, John Emery, Ray Culbert, and Scott Hamilton, all in their 20s. Being the president of the Mountaineering Club, it was Gillett's idea to go on an expedition to this unexplored route of the Rakaposhi-Haramosh sub-mountain range. It was late July 1957, the 5-man expedition team arrived in the city of Gilgit in Pakistan. Here, they were greeted by the 6 Hunza porters, whom they hired to help them carry their supplies and equipment to the camps. Half of the porter team were seasoned porters already, having assisted a lot of expeditions by then, while the other half were fairly new to the porter industry. The team started off with their hike through the north to west routes, but eventually gave in to the fact that these were nearly impossible to explore. So, the team decided to hike to Cutwell Valley to check for the next possible route going up the summit of Mount Haramosh. Upon reaching the Cutwell Valley, as they were looking up at the majestic view of the mountains, they noticed that there was a long ridge that lined towards the northeast and further to the peak of the mountain. Now, Mount Haramosh has two peaks. The first peak was 24,270 feet above sea level, while the second one was 21,930 feet above sea level. This new route that they saw would take them first to Haramosh 2, before they could get to the much higher Haramosh 1. Getting to Haramosh 1 would mean they had to descend around 600 meters from Haramosh 2, before continuing to hike up the first peak. What they couldn't see from below was that this stretch would be a long and extremely difficult one. The trail between the two peaks was filled with crevasses and a glacier that seemed like it could come crumbling anytime. It was a rough start for the five-man team and their porters. The weather has been going against them, snowing non-stop and leaving a thick pile of fresh snow on their trails. As they traversed the mountain with much struggle, they could hear the sound of a rushing avalanche of snow from mountains nearby. This kept them conscious and worried, but they pressed on, slowly but surely. It has been a month and a half since they started their expedition in Mount Haramosh. They were almost near the end of their Pakistan trip, but still very far from the summit. The team slowly advanced from Camp 1 to Camp 2, but the hike was nothing short of challenging. Weather conditions were still not improving, and forecasts don't see it improving in the next few days either. They reached Camp 3, despite the challenging conditions. However, it was also at Camp 3 that Hamilton decided to stay behind and wait for them to come back. Meanwhile, the porters went back to the lower camps after having brought all their supplies and gear to Camp 3. The other four men continued on to Camp 4, which was just less than 2,000 feet away from the Haramosh 2 peak. Emery and Colbert stopped over at Camp 4, but Gillett and Strother attempted to go further, before realizing their bodies needed a breather. Eventually, they decided to head back to Camp 4. Then came September 15th, the four men were together at Camp 4, and the skies started to clear up. This only meant one thing for them: they might have a chance to conquer the peak. Taking every chance, by 11 o'clock in the morning, the four men were now back on the trails. Strother arrived at the crest first, and the minute he saw the wide view from the top, he was awestruck. The other three climbers arrived at the crest not long after, and they too were completely in awe. The view was breathtaking, literally and figuratively. After a while, they descended a few feet below the peak where it was safer to stay and enjoy basking in the view. They sat down right below the almost vertical slope to the peak, as they felt a sense of fulfillment with how far they reached. It didn't all go exactly as planned. Had it not been for the bad weather, they could have probably reached Haramosh 2, but still, this wasn't an easy feat. Having explored the mountain was more than enough for them. However, like any other climb, reaching the summit was one thing, and descending was a whole different story. As they were about to head back to Camp 4, Gillett wanted to climb back up the peak for the last time. Together with his buddy Emery, they went back to the peak, while Strother and Colbert stayed behind. As Strother and Colbert enjoyed taking pictures of the view, suddenly, they heard a loud bang. The pile of snow where Gillett and Emery were standing gave in without warning, and sent both hikers rolling down the slope along with the avalanche. Strother and Colbert saw with their own eyes everything that happened. Fearing for the lives of their friends, they quickly looked over the steep slope to check on them. The fall was so bad that they thought they lost their friends, as they could no longer find traces of them in the thick piles of snow. But after a few heart-wrenching minutes, they sighed in great relief when they saw their friends slowly emerging from beneath the snow. The two, Emery and Gillett, landed 1,000 feet below, surrounded by thick walls of snow, with their ice axes nowhere to be found. Gillett had only one glove left, while both of Emery's gloves were missing. To make matters even worse, Emery's hip bone got dislocated due to the impact. Seeing their condition and their risk for hypothermia, Strother and Colbert decided to drop one of their backpacks filled with clothes, so their friends could add more layers to keep them warm. However, another unfortunate incident happened. the backpack landed on a different crevice. So after a failed attempt to get themselves out of the crevice, Gillett and Emery had no choice but to spend the night out in the open, embracing each other to keep them warm. The next day, wanting to help their friend so badly, Strother and Colbert agreed that the only way to help them get out of the crevice was to go down to where they were and take them out. In doing this, they're putting themselves at equal risk. It was a challenging descent, but they took each step with utmost care. After hours of difficulty, they reached Gillett and Emery, but on the way down, Colbert lost one of his crampons and Strother lost his ice axe. It was a tearful moment for the four of them, having been reunited, yet bittersweet because they still didn't know how to get themselves out. The first strategy they came up with was for the four of them to be tied together using a rope and slowly climb up and make their way out of the crevice. They were supposedly covering distance already, but Colbert, whose other crampon was missing, kept slipping and dragging the rest of the team with him back to where they started. On their fourth attempt, Strother set out first and managed to go past the traverse, the most critical stretch, but this time, it was now Gillett who slipped and brought them all falling back down at the bottom. By this time, they had no ice axes left, and the moon was setting in. They had to call it a day. Again, they embraced each other as they slept to keep each other warm. Emery and Colbert have started to suffer from frostbite, with Colbert's being worse. Meanwhile, Gillett was behaving incoherently. As soon as the sun rose the following day, they went on their fifth attempt. Having had no food or water for the past couple of days, Strother decided they should try again without tying themselves up. It was Emery who went first this time, and along the way, they found Strother's ice axe attached to the ice wall. Now, the four climbers successfully reached the traverse, and just had to descend a little in order to go back to the ridgeline where the trail back to the camps were. Emery made it back to the ridgeline safely, then Strother followed. Colbert was supposed to be next, but struggled to descend with his other foot bare and frostbitten. Strother decided to go back up to help him using the rope, but in the most critical moment, Colbert slipped, and with Strother holding him with the rope, they both fell down and were now back at the bottom. Meanwhile, Gillett was able to descend successfully back at the ridgeline. At this point, the roles had now been reversed. Emery and Gillett, who got rolled down originally by the avalanche, were now on the safer side, while it was now Strother and Colbert, the original rescuers, who needed rescuing. Sadly, as much as they would like to rescue their friends the same way they did days prior, they no longer had the strength to do it, having suffered from extreme frostbite and dehydration. In spite of the fall, Strother and Colbert were still alive, yet now very weak. The sun was beginning to set already, and Emery and Gillett decided to go ahead to Camp 4. They initially planned to quickly eat and drink to restore some of their strength, and immediately head back to rescue their friends. Back at the bottom, Strother and Colbert agreed they could no longer survive if they waited out for the sun to rise the next morning, so they tried to climb up again. Strother managed to reach the ridgeline, but Colbert, as he struggled to descend that last stretch to the ridgeline, slipped again and fell back at the bottom. This time his dislocated hip got even worse and he could barely move. Left with no choice, Strother had to start heading his way back to Camp 4 alone without his buddy. He managed to reach Camp 4 and saw Emery, who was in a semi-conscious state. After looking around, he couldn't see any trace of Gillett at Camp 4. Apparently, as Gillett and Emery were heading back to Camp 4 hours earlier, Gillett's pace was faster, and Emery, who was starting to become delirious, was trying to catch up to Gillett with much struggle. However, as he tried to follow Gillett's trail, he fell into another crevasse and became unconscious. The following morning, he woke up and was able to gather back his senses and tried to climb out of the crevice. He managed to get himself out, and along the way, he saw Gillett's footsteps again. He realized that Gillett might have fallen into the crevasse as well, and also managed to get himself out. So, he decided to continue following Gillett's footsteps again. Much to his surprise, the footsteps had stopped at a much deeper crevasse, and it was there that he realized that Gillett fell into it. This crevasse was around a 2,000-meter drop. He tried to shout and call for Gillett, hoping he would get a response, but after doing it many times and failing to get a response, he decided to continue his journey back to Camp 4. As soon as he reached the camp, Emery collapsed. He has already been suffering from extreme frostbite by this time. He regained consciousness a few hours later as he got reunited with Strother. Upon hearing what Emery recounted, Strother tried to go back to the nearby crevasse to look for Gillett. Like Emery, he shouted and tried to call Gillett from the edge of the crevasse but did not get any response. Both Strother and Emery badly wanted to head back for another attempt to rescue Colbert, but their bodies were too weak, dehydrated and extremely frostbitten that they could no longer move their hands. Strother realized he could only help Emery reach Camp 3, with the little strength he has left. The two struggled to walk with their already weak bodies, but managed to reach Camp 3 where Hamilton was waiting for them. Hamilton, who decided not to continue with the climb, started to get worried for his friends on the third day that they had not returned. Concerned for his teammates, he decided to prepare food and drinks for when they would come back and might need something to recharge themselves after a long hike. What he didn't expect was that only two of his friends were back in extremely bad condition, and worse, hearing of Gillett's and Colbert's untimely death. Hamilton assisted Strother and Emery back to Camp 1, where the porters took over, and brought them all to get the medical attention they badly needed. It has not been stated whether the bodies of Gillett and Colbert were ever recovered. Haramosh 1 was first successfully conquered the following year by a team from Austria, but it was only in 1995 that Haramosh 2 had been successfully conquered by a team from Britain. However, two climbers from the same team died upon descent. The story of this Oxford University Mountaineering Club expedition to Mount Haramosh was not just a horrifying story, but also one that displayed extreme persistence, determination, will, and companionship. More often than not, tragedies have the tendency to push people to the limit, and sadly, tough decisions had to be made on Mount Haramosh. Thank you for making it this far. If you want more of these horrifying stories, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. You may also drop your comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you and see you on the next one.